There's a stoic exercise that you can do to help you gain a little bit of perspective. And basically, what you do is you zoom out, in your mind, of course, out above your head and then out above whatever building you're in, to the neighborhood, maybe to the city, then to the state, and then zoom all the way out to the whole world, and then further. Keep on going. And the whole point of this is to provide you with some kind of perspective on both your own place in the world, but also the sheer magnitude of what's around you. In today's episode, I want you to allow yourself to zoom out to that perspective. I want you to think much larger than, your own career today, just as an exercise to gain a little bit of perspective. And I want you to ask big questions, because today's episode is an interview with someone who does exactly that. His name is Kevin Kelly. Kevin is always thinking about the future. He's always thinking about how technology is going to shape our future in various parts of our culture. Kevin is probably most well known as an author. Most recently, he wrote the New York Times bestseller, The Inevitable, and before that, he wrote What Technology Wants. And before that, in 1993, Kevin co-founded Wired and then served as the executive editor for its first 7 years. But the fact that I think is most intriguing about Kevin is, in all of his thinking about the future, he remains eternally optimistic. And there's a reason for that, not just because he's a positive person, but we're going to get into that in the interview. I don't want to give too much away. I'm so humbled and excited to have Kevin on the show. He's been very much so a guiding light for the way that I think and believe about the world and about technology and our place in between those two things. So thank you so much again to Kevin for joining me on Developer Tea. I encourage you to pick up pretty much anything he's written, but What Technology Wants, and of course, his most recent book, The Inevitable. Now let's jump straight into this interview with Kevin Kelly. Welcome to the show, Kevin.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm really excited to have you on. I and my colleagues at Whiteboard, we've been very big fans of the work that you've done, the books that you've written, and your perspective, and generally the idea that optimists, they hold the keys really to creating the future of technological advancement. And you quite literally write the book on these topics. So it's really exciting to get a chance to talk to you here. I'd love to start out with a question, and it's kind of an open-ended question, really, but it's very simple. What is one thing you wish more people would ask you about? Sometimes the simple questions are the hardest to answer, aren't they?
Yeah, because in fact, particularly since I'm in the mode of being interviewed, I'm being asked about everything. It's really hard to think what I wish they would ask me more about. I'm going to answer this question in a different way. I'm going to tell you what I wish people would not ask me about.
Okay, sounds great.
And that is, there's a kind of common fear or a scenario right now of the robots taking over and taking all our jobs. And I get that question every single time. And the reason why I kind of am a little tired of the question is because I think I think the question is coming from Hollywood movies. I don't know if people are really afraid that the robots are going to kill us all and take over, but they ask because they saw it in Terminator or there's science fiction movies or because other people are asking it or something. I find it hard to believe that people really have that fear.
Right, yeah.
But they feel as if they need to ask that question. So, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe people really are afraid that the robots are going to kill them all and take over. But it doesn't feel like that. I mean, I don't know. I feel as if this is sort of like a question that they should be asking, so they ask.
Kind of like they're playing their part in that movie.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so a very interesting thing because, and you talk about this in larger forums because so many people are asking that question. We certainly are not going to focus on that question. I think a really interesting part of that is also, again, going back to the fact that you believe in optimism as a driving force for the creation of the positive future, right? And this fear-driven question of are the robots going to take over, it kind of gives up the power of creation. It gives up the ability to drive that, right? To make that decision as humanity progresses. Are the robots going to take over and steal our jobs and come and kill all our crops and drive us out of our homes? That really kind of presupposes that you are not participating in the creation of those robots to begin with.
And that may be part of it, but I think actually, to be honest, I think people like myself and science fiction writers have failed to provide an alternative, optimistic view of the future that somebody could believe in and would also want to live in. So there really aren't any detailed, fleshed out, visible um, scenarios or movies about the future on this planet that people want to live in. And I think people kind of retreat to this other one because they don't have much of a choice. And so people like myself or science fiction authors have failed to produce a viable vision of the future that is desirable. And so part of what I'm trying to do in this book is to begin to try to outline what I would think is a version of the future that is optimistic, that you'd want to live in. And that's plausible in the sense of given what we know of where things are going and where we're headed. So it's not like it's an alternative future where we don't have technology. I'm saying if we have more tracking and more AI and more virtual reality and ubiquitous this and that, then I'm trying to make a version where say, I think we can make this work. I think this would be a good place I want to live. But
Yeah.
I haven't been able to flesh it out like a way a movie would be. And that is something that is in some senses a failure of people like me and other science fiction authors.
Well, and perhaps the inevitable will be good material for those science fiction authors to draw from, and kind of like raw material. It seems like it could be that, right?
Yeah, in fact, I joke with my science fiction author friends. Yeah, here, steal as much of this as you possibly
Yeah,
can.
yeah.
And so,
Kind of like you're laying
uh,
the groundwork of the worlds that they can write on top of.
yeah, and that's sort of my next project is to do a bit more world building to try and make something that is more coherent. And it has a history too. That's the other missing element for most science fiction worlds is they don't really have a history. So history meaning that they're only kind of 1 year, but to really make a world deep enough, you kind of have to have well, what was it like 10 years before that and 10 years before that because these things don't arrive.
What is the
Uh,
etymology? Yeah,
well, yeah, I mean it's like if we look around, we don't. Not everybody's in a fly. Not everybody's driving a car. People still riding bicycles, and there's still old cars, and there's still people walking, and there's still there's occasionally a Segway and skateboard, and so it's all the precursors to that technology kind of exist alongside the new stuff as well. So, but important thing is that I'm trying to urge more people to be involved in trying to develop visions of the future that we want to live in. It's not difficult
yeah,
to imagine a world that we don't want. The dystopian worlds, it's actually not that difficult to imagine lots of them, and they make great stories, and
sure.
masterful stories tellers will always kind of gravitate to a dystopia because there's much more built-in conflict and drama.
Yeah, there's
But
opportunity for
yeah,
heroes in those.
exactly. But I think we need more visions of a future that we would want to live in. And unless we give them, people are going to retreat and just naturally assume that the worst.
Yeah, this reminds me, and all of your work really reminds me of one of the great computer science pioneers, Alan Kay. He has this quote. He says, "The best way to predict the future is to invent it." And this is so compelling for me as a software developer, and for the people who are listening to this show, largely are software developers as well. I'd love to ask you kind of a more driving question for you, kind of a deeper question. I want you to talk about what drives you to care about being a futurist. And reading through your biography, you've lived 100 lives. It seems there's so many different things that you've done. You have so many experiences. Um, of course, acting as senior executive editor of Wired, but also doing things like starting an index of every living species, right? Extensive research on things like digestion at the microscopic level, and also writing multiple books, including your graphic novel, The Silver Cord. But I'd love to know, all of this kind of has one thing in common, and that is looking into the future and caring about the future. Can you kind of tell me about the moment that you realized that you cared so much about the future?
Well, there are two ways to answer this. There was a moment when I had a self-assigned experiment to live as if I was going to die in 6 months, and as part of that process, I had to surrender the future each day. Um, and by the end, I basically had eradicated my future because I was taking it seriously and preparing not to have any days beyond the last day. And what that made me realize was that having a future was an essential part of being human. That when you cut away any hope of the future, um, you're just less than what we are meant to be, and that being able to look forward into something is an essential part of being a human and being
Mm,
alive. And so I began to think that it was less kind of like an indulgence or a pastime, but it was more essential to our being. And then, as I got older, technology seemed to be accelerating, and so there was this new sensation that, oh my gosh, my my life is going to change, or the world's going to change within my lifetime. It won't be anywhere like the same world that I'm going to die in as I was born in. And so therefore, in order to, be of service to the world, which is changing very fast, I have to kind of think, well, where's it going to be? Because you have to, things take time to do. So therefore, they change before you're finished them, so you are obligated in some senses to start to think about the changes in the future. And it seems that parts of the future are changing even faster than before, and so that responsibility, I guess I would call it, of looking into the future in order to do good work, um, it seems to me to now be a general assignment that everybody needs to follow. So
mm,
to be a good citizen, you essentially have to look into the future a little bit. And taking the long view, which I think we should do more often, which is that being involved in things that may not be done within your lifetime.
yeah.
I mean, we are the benefit of people who have took the long view, who built roads that or bridges or cities that took a long time to build and were built with the idea that they'd be around a long time, or worked on something that was not even finished in their lifetime. And if you take that view, which I think we should more often, then you definitely have to think about the future.
Yeah.
And so I think to be a responsible human in 2017, you need to think about the future to some extent.
We're going to take a quick sponsor break, and then we'll be right back to the interview with Kevin Kelly. Today's episode is sponsored by Rollbar. With Rollbar, you can see what errors are lurking in your code without you realizing it. Dealing with errors is really difficult sometimes, right? You have to rely on your users to actually report errors to you, and of course, at that point, you've possibly lost business, or you've lost a client if you're in an agency position. You have to dig through logs trying to debug these issues. You start adding new code to your project just to figure out what's going wrong with the code that already is there. With Rollbar, you can integrate with all major languages and frameworks and start tracking production errors in just a few minutes. You can integrate Rollbar into your existing workflow, and you'll send errors and alerts to your favorite services like Slack or HipChat, and you can link the source code in GitHub, Bitbucket, or in GitLab. You can even turn errors into issues in Jira, in Pivotal Tracker, in Trello, all of the things that you're probably used to using. And of course, there's so many integrations that we can't list them all in this ad read. Go and check out what they have to offer. Some of their customers, by the way, include Heroku, Twilio, Kayak, Instacart, Zendesk, Twitch. I've used basically all of those in the last month or so. Go and check it out, rollbar.com/developer-T. That's rollbar.com/developer-T, and you can get the Bootstrap plan for free for 90 days. Thanks again to Rollbar for sponsoring today's episode of Developer T. Yeah, that's excellent, excellent perspective, because there are so many things that we benefit from today, and a lot of the people who created the things that we use today are still alive, but so many things in this world are the result of progress over hundreds and sometimes even thousands of years, depending on what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just in Paris, which was this magnificent city built on a grand scale with people obviously, hundreds of years ago with the intention of, making something that would last a long time. And I think, in the field you're in, software development, it often seems very ephemeral, but I'm willing to bet that, I don't know, in 100 years, there'll still be code, TCP, or, Unix kernels that will still be being used.
Yeah.
In 100 years. And so it's not quite fair to assume that what you're doing won't last. And so there should be some acknowledgement, some recognition, some incorporation as you're working that, it's possible that this will be around for a long time. And so therefore, I should treat it in that responsible way.
Yeah, I think some of that comes from the reality that this stuff just hasn't been around for very long. It's a new building material, and so it seems as though since it hasn't been around long, it can't stay around long.
Right, but that's actually not entirely true.
Sure, yeah.
It hasn't been around long, but it may be around. Parts of it may be around a lot longer than anybody ever expected.
Sure, and also because. I've talked about this on the show before, but the idea that code doesn't really, it doesn't rust like a car would, right? Assuming that the logic is still intact and nobody's coming in and changing that code. Next year, that code is the same as it was last year. It's a representation of an idea more than it is anything else. And so that code staying around is certainly not only possible, but I would say probably likely, right? Because it doesn't really age. It doesn't have the same breakdown characteristics as something physical would.
Yeah, and so, I said 100 years, wouldn't it be amazing if in 1,000 years someone, there were some parts that were still, there was some guy
still being used
somewhere. Yeah. It was, he would be, he's long gone. No one remembers him, but, that little subroutine is still going. And, so, well, just as there are probably, there are bricks and stones in some of these walls or buildings that are from the Roman times, and there's some anonymous builder who laid it, and yeah. So I think the I the whole point here of thinking about the future is not so much that I don't know how much difference that would make actually in terms of how you craft the code, but certainly on deciding what kinds of things you want to work on, and the characteristics. I mean, the all the other things about that, the assumptions about your assumptions about people's behavior and all these things
Yeah.
are things that can be impacted by your view of the future.
And one of the things that sticks out to me about, as a millennial, I know people like to talk about our generation in a variety of ways. And we won't go deep into any one of those subjects, but one of the things that I have experienced with myself and people around me who are in my generation is this kind of nonchalantness about what we're doing and the things that we're building. And you mentioned something there that kind of alluded to this, and that is, it's not really about how you're writing the code, but how much you care about it, and what you're actually investing in what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. So many people, unfortunately, and that I've seen personally witnessed, so many developers end up not caring. They disconnect from this work that they're doing, whatever that work may be, and almost live in this kind of subconscious or not subconscious, but disconnected state where they don't really have a profession, or they don't really seem to be engaging with the world in any meaningful way. They're just kind of working through their days. And
Yeah.
it's a very strange disconnection, kind of a tragedy of the digital state, perhaps.
Yeah, and they're they are making decisions and choices even when people think that they aren't. They still are. Um, uh, and all code has certain worldviews and assumptions built into it, even when you don't think it is. I mean, so
Yeah.
there are just biases and um, points of view in everything that we do. May not be aware of them. They may seem invisible to us, but they'll be apparent to someone in 100 years from now. And so I think part of thinking about the future is a chance to reflect and examine and think about these invisible assumptions and points of view, because you can kind of look at it from afar. The point about thinking about the future is we really can't predict it. We're not. We're not really capable of
Mm-hmm.
predicting the future. It's an exercise to try to predict the present. It's an exercise to it's a way to help us be present today. And so the little thought of experiment of trying to predict the future is usually going to be wrong, but it's going to illuminate what it is that we're doing today and what the assumptions we have and the biases and the perspectives. And so we gives us a chance to kind of tune and improve those.
Yeah, it's excellent. The book that you wrote, The Inevitable, it talks about 12 different forces that are going to shape the next 30 years. I would say of culture in large, not just digital culture, because this idea that digital is somehow running in parallel to us I think is totally inaccurate. I think we are that this is really ingrained in culture, not just a separate thing. It's not like a media channel. It's very much integrated into our lives. One of the things you discuss is this idea of inefficiency, or efficiency versus inefficiency, the things that we should be efficient at as humans, or rather the things that we should offload to machines to allow them to be efficient at. And I think you mentioned at one point being embarrassed at some of the jobs that we once held, looking back, and this kind of cycle of handing off those jobs to something that is more that is better suited to do that job. Can you discuss with me the things that we should allow to be inefficient?
Yeah. So, just to kind of a little example of the point you're making about being embarrassed by some of the jobs that politicians and other people are fighting over. I think we will, in 100 years from now, be embarrassed by the fact that we had any humans doing these jobs. And just today in the New York Times, there was an editorial by a guy who was saying we need to save the jobs of cashiers. And it was like, no, counting money is just a terrible waste of a human being.
Yeah.
You don't want humans to do that, because that is a job where efficiency and productivity matter, and that's the kinds of jobs that bots are going to be better at. And the kinds of things that humans are good at are things that where efficiency is not important, and things like science, say, are inherently inefficient because you have to try things that don't work. You're going to have failed experiments. If there was a scientist who claimed to be 100% efficient, that scientist is not learning anything. They're just repeating the same. If every experiment they do succeeds, it's like basically it's impossible.
Sure.
And the same thing with innovation. So we all recognize that innovation is the foundation, the engine driving the new economy, the generating wealth. And that process of innovation is inherently inefficient. You're trying things that don't work. You are going to dead ends. You're exploring. You are making mistakes. You're doing prototypes. All of them, by definition, are not 100% efficient. It's inherently an inefficient process, and we understand that learning is not necessarily efficient. It's inherently inefficient, and so and creativity and art are all inherently inefficient. Nobody was ranking painters by how many paintings per day they were making.
Yeah.
That's efficiency. And so it turns out that the things that where we're wasting time, so to speak, are the things that we love to do most. Human relationships are inherently inefficient. Small talk, I mean, it's like, that's not efficient. Well, it's necessary, it's good, it's what people like. And so we will gravitate to those kinds of roles as we give the bots the tasks that are necessarily productive or efficient, and that also happens to be the things that we love to do the most. As I said, we don't like doing the rote things. We don't like being efficient in a certain sense, and so our job will be kind of discovering these new things, and as we discover some new task that is of value to other people, the more we do it, the more we'll kind of figure out what needs to be done, the more efficiency will become part of it, and then at that point we give it over to the bots, to the AIs and the robots, and that's going to be a continual process. We move on to something else. We start to have questions. We do investigations and explorations. We discover some new desire we didn't know we had. And then we have a new task, a new job, which in the beginning is very vague and unclear. And then over time, it becomes clear. And at that point, it goes to the bots. So in the long run, our job as humans is to keep inventing jobs to give to the robots.
Thank you so much for listening to the first part of my interview with Kevin Kelly. I hope this has challenged your thinking and excited you about the future, but also created a roadmap in front of you of a lot of work, a lot of exciting work that you and I get to engage in on a daily basis. Thank you again to Kevin for joining me on Developer Tea, and make sure you subscribe if you don't want to miss out on the second part of this interview. We're going to talk more about AI. We're going to talk about optimism, all of the things that Kevin is so well known for at this point, and more of the same types of topics we've been talking about in this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you again to Rollbar for sponsoring today's episode of Developer Tea. Of course, you can get started with the Bootstrap plan for free for 90 days by going to rollbar.com/developertea, and you can get started tracking your errors in any production environment. Go and check it out, rollbar.com/developertea. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, enjoy your tea.